Hey, thanks, Amir. If I can share the screen, um, give me 1 second. All right, I assume everybody can see my screen. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Thanks, Amir. I am the lucky guy to pick up after lunch. So I will try to keep this as informative as possible. And if you do have any questions throughout, certainly drop them in the Q&A bucket, and I'll pick them up as we go, if that works best. But yeah, thanks for joining. Today we're going to talk a little bit about security monitoring with Splunk at the Tech Center. So what I intend to cover here today is just a little bit about how we use Splunk, what the tooling is that we leverage to do some of our detections. Also, why we use Splunk. Many reasons, but we'll go a little bit more in depth there, and also how you guys can use Splunk. We've had this Splunk environment for a number of years now. A number of colleges leverage it to date, but also want to just at a very high level talk about how you can also get into this environment, what decisions need to be made, and how we can help you get to that point. So first, what is Splunk? I'm sure it's a term everybody here has probably heard for a couple of years. I know I've done a number of these presentations to date, but Splunk is pretty much a tool for logs, bringing your logs in, giving you visibility into what you have going on in your everyday life from a system standpoint. So, some of the most common use cases, within Splunk are listed here up on the right-hand side, straight from application delivery down to IoT type of data. Now, we primarily use Splunk for security information, but that's just scratches the surface of what we could potentially do. On the left-hand side, you see, a lot of the different areas that we can touch. You pretty much from endpoints, firewalls, network devices. I have yet to find a system that I could pull data in from and leverage in the Splunk environment. Now, what is good about Splunk is it, pretty much any data that you can think of, you can pull in and leverage it without having to do any structural analysis of the data prior to moving it into Splunk. So, the data as it comes in is schemaless, as opposed to some other systems out there that are commonly advertised. So data processing, getting your data into Splunk is relatively easy, as long as you have the pieces open and direct network access. But when it comes to security, primarily what the type of data that we see in the environments for schools spans from your Windows endpoint data to to the firewall data, things that are important to analyze your security posture. And also, within our Splunk environment, there are many out-of-the-box use cases that you can pull down from Splunk Base. Splunk does have its own store. So, inside of the Splunk Base store, you can download different applications, different ways of chewing and processing the data so that you can see the data in a very readable type of fashion. If you are currently in our Splunk environment and there's an application that we don't have that you could or would like to leverage, certainly let us know. We can get that installed for you and make everything look and feel as good as possible for you. But taking advantage of Splunk Base, and I'm going to show Splunk Base here in a little bit, it's certainly your easy button to making Splunk functional for your use cases. Before I get to that point, though, I want to talk a little bit about what we use inside of the Tech Center for our processing, for our data analysis. Right now, we use a security product that we've gotten off of, or is also available on Splunk Base. What this does for us is gives us the ability to do incident management based on the different types of data that we pull into Splunk for our internal needs. AWS primarily, but gives us the feel of a SIM. In the short term, prior to moving to something a little more formal in the future. But using this tool, which is called Patronus, that we've been leveraging for about a year now, gives us the ability to run correlation searches in the environment using a method of scoring called risk-based analysis. Risk-based analysis being a way of evaluating, the things that you care most in your security environment, which are your people and your machines, and applying a score to them, and alerting on that score once a threshold is exceeded. So, using this product, we have roughly over 450 out-of-the-box searches that can be leveraged, spanning from Windows data, AWS data, many other endpoint systems that we could potentially leverage. But primarily we're using the AWS searches for now, but can be expanded in the future. We also have visibility to threat management feeds that are commonly used, freely available out there in the internet space, that we evaluate our IPs, our domains, our file hashes, if any, against, to determine if there are any threats that need to be very quickly analyzed and actioned on. And I'm gonna do a quick demo of this product here in a few minutes, just to just give you a high level show of the features of what we're currently using. But also very important is the executive view. Important in all SIM-like applications. Just to give you the high level view of your security posture and how everything is functioning inside of your environment. How do we use it? Yeah, exactly here. Correlation analysis, threat management, risk-based alerting is the most important aspect here. Back in 2019, Splunk did a lot of advertisement in its own, or with its own security software, enterprise security, to move in the risk-based analysis or risk-based alerting. There's a couple different terms that RBA can be translated to, but moving into that space. So leveraging this product gives us the kind of the stepping stone into a more formal SIM in the future with that scoring model in place. We have had a number of detections that we've worked inside of this environment, and like I said, over 400 detections out of the box that can be leveraged. But instead of talking about it, I can just flip the screen here. We can take a quick look at it and just show you, a little bit about how we use it, and just what out of this application we might also be able to make available to you guys. Now, the application itself we can't, but there are a lot of searches that might be valuable that different folks might want to use inside of their local school environment. But like I said, executive summary, high level view of different things that are happening in the environment. Just with a NIST flavor on top of it. You see the protect, detect, respond, recover. Down here at the bottom right, we see a threat map, which is based off of our threat feeds overall, and just a look at all of our detections, what the detections look like over time, and how many incidents we have out here running. This is a demo environment, so we are going to be looking at demo data here. Going over onto our incident management page, this is what folks are looking at to determine different detections and issues and the scores that have been accumulating over time. So here we see a timeline. The goal is to have everything closed as things are detected and worked, and just a high level view of different folks that are working, and analysts, or the different analysts that are working, and tickets that are currently assigned. Down at the bottom, we see our incidents. This is where we really determine whether or not there's issues that need to be worked or not. Usually we look at the multiple source state, or the Yeah, the multiple source space, because those are the ones that are more important, but we can also see the ones that are singular. A lot of times when we see singular detections that are run-ups, a lot of times those are threat activities, around IPs, malware, etc. But the multiple ones are the ones that become concerning because they're the ones that are hit by multiple vectors. When you have a detection that is hit, from multiple directions, it's usually a good indication that it's something that we need to look at. So looking at, just our additional details, the different type of searches that we were running, we see that there is some type of credential dump that is that's running inside of the environment. It gives us something to work off of, so that as we're working through the issue, we see the detections, we see the scores, we see the different types of hits. From here, we could also drill down and see the detailed data of what does occur. And from the detailed data, we can get right down to the specific nuts and bolts of a detection, looking at the timelines overall and seeing the commands that are being executed, and so on and so forth. So, we've found a lot of value in this. Gives us the ability to do a little bit more with the data that that we're working with. Also within here, we can, get a view of MITRE, just the detections that we've been executing or that have been executed overall, whether, the layout of the available searches, our enabled searches, or just straight up the triggered events over time. This, is a decent view just to see what our coverage looks like overall. And, I had mentioned a lot of searches being available, within this product. We have roughly 493 of them, but we give a nice little page here where you can dig in to the different type of searches that are available. And with this, we can really drill down into the specifics of what we really care about seeing in our environment. And with that information, we can get to detections that are important to us, that we can execute on. We can manipulate scorings and make everything pretty easy for us to work with overall. There is a filtering capability in this as well. That helps us eliminate the noise. So we found a lot of value in this. We'll we can, if anybody has interest in just seeing the searches that are available and things that you could potentially leverage, certainly let us know. Drop a comment. We can certainly have that conversation, set up a call, and make some of these searches available on your Splunk search ad. If you want to execute them, if you want to set up your own alerts for email notification or whatnot. Let me switch back over, and if there are any questions, just again, drop them into chat, and happy to answer. But we talked a little bit about Splunk for how we use Splunk, but also want to talk a little bit about how you guys can leverage Splunk as well. So as mentioned prior, we've had this Splunk environment for a couple of years now. We've been building this out. We've been changing our strategies around here and there to make it easier for the schools to leverage. So on the bottom right hand side, we see what our rough structure looks like. And I'm not going to go in great detail of what the wiring diagram looks like, but the gist of it is we have different models. We have different models to potentially meet your needs. We know that every school doesn't have possibly the funding for additional hardware. We know that some things might be difficult to get in and open up and whatnot. So we have a couple of different models that can be leveraged here. Now, when your school's data makes it into the Splunk environment, or we configure it into the Splunk environment, we isolate the storage of your data. So, for example, school, your indexes would be named school underscore index name. So if we have win event logs, it would be school underscore win event log, or Linux data, school underscore OS or Linux, depending on what the standard is and how we want to make those available to you. But we have a pipeline that we do currently work to help you guys get this all set up. As mentioned, 20 gigabytes of data ingestion. This limit isn't enforced very tightly, but if we do see continuous overages of the 20 gigs, we will certainly reach out and let you all know. But talking about the couple of different strategies here, we have our top option, which is leverages what we call a heavy forwarder, which is a Splunk environment that we use to isolate data going to our backend systems. So what that means is installing the agents on all of your endpoints. Once you install all the agents on your endpoints, we would then control the flow of data to your heavy forwarder. What this gives you the ability to do is, one, centralized traffic. I'm a big fan of centralized traffic, or centralizing traffic outside of outside of the network. It just makes it easier for whitelisting and just tracing traffic overall. Also gives you the ability to do local API executions. So many local applications, security applications that you may have on-prem that you want to process data for. What you can do here is set up those applications that we could potentially pull down from Splunk Base and execute those API calls, pull that data in and process. And that's something that we will work with your teams on, to make that process a little bit easier. You'll also have the ability to process syslog data, opening up syslog ports, something from 1024 and up. All ports under 1024 are root privileged, so we can't open those up using Splunk. But the heavy forwarder option, or the top option that we're looking at here, gives you the most flexibility, the most ability to pull in any type of data that you're really looking to pull in. So if you do have a cloud provider, AWS, Azure, and we want to pull that data in, the heavy forwarder option would be necessary in order to do that. Now, down at the bottom, we have what we'll consider a light option. If you don't have the resources, if you don't have the ability to stand up a local server, what we do is we just install those endpoints on those forwarder agents, or you guys would install the forwarder agents or universal forwarders on the boxes or your endpoints, and point to our deployment server. Our deployment server would then pass down the configurations to send directly to us. So if you look back a page here, we have a tiny Cribble cluster that is the intake for the lighter option. This way we can segment ports out for each individual school, processing that data, verifying that the connections are always up, and isolating that traffic to your specific indexes in the downstream system. We found that to be better than standing up additional Splunk boxes, since it gives us more control at the port level. But really, it comes down to what makes the most sense for your school. And when you start the intake process with our team, we'll go through all of the details around this, make sure the option that is best, is best discussed with you guys, or is discussed with you guys, so that we can get this up and running for you. I do see a question. Does Scenic SOC have access to CCC Splunk? I don't know. Amir, you might have to answer that one if you happen to know the answer. But we can save that to the end if you're not currently ready to answer that one. Now, what can you do with the Splunk environment once you have it? Pretty much anything. So I talked a little bit about how we use Splunk. You guys can do something very similar, but with your own build out. Security data is what we are targeting inside of this environment. If you want to pull operational data in, I think that becomes a conversation. I don't know that it's that we're currently allowing that, since operational data can be extremely noisy and and kind of big over time. But you know, again, that could be a conversation that we can certainly have. Leveraging the out-of-the-box applications, many are available. I'm going to show you Infosec here in a little bit, but you know, going on the Splunk base again, searching for security, you'll see a lot of different applications, applications that will parse your data out and make things readable for you guys. Also, you know, different dashboard applications as well, depending on how you want to leverage your Splunk environment. Infosec is probably the most popular free application out there. It gives you a very high level view of your security posture based on the data models in the environment. Security Essentials gives you just a very good rundown of the different security use cases that can be leveraged as well. Also, with your data in a system, you guys have the ability to set up alarms. Whether you want something to go to email, whether you want something to go to a chat system, text message, you know, many different options there. But setting up the alarms, you know, I will recommend that you don't set those up to run every minute. But yeah, you can run them pretty frequently. And question from Edwin: 20 gig limit per college or district? Per college. Per school that we set up, that will that's currently the limit. So you know, we do have dashboards out there that keeps an eye on it. Dashboard creation, you know, if you can't find a Splunk based application that has a dashboard that fits your need, what I would recommend is you know, if you have a set of searches that does the identification of the data, you know, give us a call. We can work with you guys to help build out dashboards as needed and for what makes sense. You know, as I mentioned, Splunk Base, you know, some of the applications that are out there, you know, Infosec, Security Essentials, CIS, you know, really it's pretty wide open of what you could potentially do with applications that are currently sitting out there in Splunk Base. But instead of me talking about it, let me pull it up for you guys real quick, and we can take a look to see what is out there in Splunk Base. So if you're looking at the Splunk Base environment, it really, you know, brings you to this screen, and you can really do any type of search you're looking for. If you're looking for just straight up security applications, you can, you know, come out here, type security, and see what's available. You know, I had mentioned the Infosec app, which is, you know, pretty popular out there. Infosec app gives you a lot of visuals, gives you a lot of capabilities, different things that you want to see, you know, in the environment. Now, one thing that's important about Splunk Base is when you're downloading applications or finding applications to meet your need. Let's say, for example, you have Palo Alto or Palo firewalls. We go and we look for the Palo Alto network add-on. Now, when you see things that are called add-ons, these are applications that do your data parsing for you at search time. So different from other logging environments. What Splunk does, you know, as mentioned before, data comes in schemaless. So it doesn't care the structure, it just, you know, puts the data in your index and allows you to do something with it. At search time, what happens is the applications, the configurations that are on each of your search heads, which is, you know, where you guys log in, do your searches, do your dashboards, they all get evaluated. And, you know, that's what makes data, you know, visible. So you might see the source field, the destination field. These are all things that are extracted using configurations coming from apps like this. But, you know, when we look at these applications, what's important is we take a look at, you know, this little you know, note here, which is SIM version. That's the Common Information Model version that that this application uses. The Common Information Model is the ability to you know, map your fields to a data model. Now, in mapping your fields to a data model, it makes some of the applications that you can get off of Splunk Base, including Infosec, makes them all light up. If you don't have these applications in place, you know, the applications won't light up, the dashboard panels won't light up, and you won't be able to see much of your information. So again, you know, as you guys are getting your data in the environment, as you guys are working through this, it's important to you know, reach out to us, have that conversation, make sure the data that's coming in is being processed in some way so that, you know, you can actually get the true benefits of it. But, you know, also in here, I mentioned some other applications, Security Essentials. Security Essentials is a fairly, you know, important application inside of here. You know, it's an app that I would, you know, years ago call a sales app, but what they've now done is they've broken things out inside of the application to show you all the different types of searches that you can leverage based on the data that you're processing. And, you know, you can then go into further detail to see how that maps to CIS, how it maps to NIST, how it maps to MITRE. And, you know, in a lot of the cases, the searches are included. So you can then take those searches, drop them into your environment, set up alerts around them, and get those rolling for your indexes. You know, also gives you a lot of other views around MITRE and whatnot, just so that you can then drill down. You know, this is the page I was talking about where you can see how things are mapped. You know, this one specifically mapped to the kill chain, MITRE tactics, techniques, and then just, you know, overall information about that type of alarm and how you can leverage it inside of your environment. We do have Security Essentials installed on our search end, as well as the Infosec app. I believe we also have the CIS top 25 controls, a couple of different ones that that you can leverage throughout your Splunk journey here. But to dive into and talk a little bit more about Infosec, you know, this is the Infosec app. This is again another demo environment that allows me to show you, you know, just different bits of information and you know, see everything lit up. Now, as I mentioned before, if your data is not mapped to the common information model or data models, you're not going to be able to view any data. So if you're just looking at, you know, your straight up data, usually when you log into Splunk, you're approached with a screen like this, which is essentially a Google bar that you can do anything you want to. Now, you know, in most environments, if you just do a straight up search, you know, you're not going to be able to pull up data because in our environment, we restrict things by index. But, you know, you can usually do a search like an index equals star and a value in order to see what type of data is in the environment around what you're interested in. You know, if we're looking at the different types of data in this test environment, you can do something similar to this type of query, stats count by index and source type. This will just give you a list of all of the indexes and source types that are available, and, you know, information that we can get a further look on. So going back to what I had mentioned in the Splunk Base app, so we have Palo Alto data in here. So if we come in here to the demo pan index, if we didn't have this application in place, all of these fields over here on the left-hand side wouldn't be visible. You would just pretty much have a straight up log and nothing else. And I think I can demonstrate that just by going to fast mode. So if we didn't have the application, this is essentially what you would be presented with, and you wouldn't be able to search for any of the metadata. Now, what the Splunk applications do is they make this easier for you. So with the Palo Alto app in place, you can now search based on you know, interpretations of the data. We can see, you know, the different actions. We can see the action flags, the applications, you know, pretty much all sources, destinations, devices, products, etc. The applications that come free out of the box from Splunk Base make your life easier. So, you know, when we have the conversation about data onboarding and about and you're part of the pipeline about getting your data in flight, let's have the conversation of what applications are needed to make your life easier inside of this environment. All right, so going back to the Infosec page. So talking a little bit about that, without the applications, a lot of the stuff wouldn't be visible, but here we see we have lit up dashboards. So inside of the Infosec app, there's a lot of pieces inside of here that can be leveraged. So when you drop in here, you see your security posture overall. So with no work other than putting your data inside of Splunk, installing your applications, you can go into this app and see your data. So, instant value, excuse me. So instant value, once your data is fully onboarded. So diving into this a little bit, this is essentially your single pane of glass, high level information about all of the data that we have processed inside of the environment. Gives you, your intrusion type information, anything around malware, your assets, your identities, as mentioned, similar to the tooling that we use, assets and identities are probably the most important things that we care about, making sure we have an eye on those, making sure we have data and logs processing on them, seeing a high level of alerts and just a breakdown of, hosts over time and hosts over or views over accounts. Diving into this application a little bit, you'll see under continuous monitoring, Windows access and changes. Knowing that we are a pretty big Microsoft shop, some of these tabs are going to light up for you pretty much right out of the box. Seeing your locked out accounts, privilege escalations, and so on. High level instant visibility of your data and things that might be of a concern, might be things that we can then drill down into to do additional detections. This application I consider great from a visual standpoint, but I would also recommend from a security standpoint you build in your detections as well. So where the visual is half of it, that means you have to be logged in and looking at it. The detections, would run on the back end and alert you, and I'll show you how that gets set up in a moment as well. But going through these, I'm not going to go through all these. There's lots and lots of different tabs inside of here, but some of the highlights, authentications, also kind of big. It's definitely something of interest. Things that are top talkers, things that or people that are authenticating or failing to authenticate or have locked out accounts and so on. Malware, again, all data models. So, as long as you have your malware data model populated, data will continue to populate. Network traffic, seeing your top talkers, top ports, things that might be of interest. If you have a lot of connections that are failing, a lot of things that are coming in over ports that don't make a lot of sense, gives you a good mechanism for drilling down. You'll notice a lot of the dashboards are very similar. It's really high level up top and the drill down below with this fancy link board. And VPN access. This was a prototype not too long ago, but happy to see it finally rolled into the main. But it gives you an eye on VPN access. We are in a very disconnected world now, with a lot of folks working from home. So making sure folks are connecting through VPN and from the right locations. Finding connections that are happening over in other parts of the world might not make a lot of sense to us. So, I would think most of our connections would happen in North America or, maybe a handful outside. But seeing things outside, would definitely raise an alarm for me. Going over to advanced threats, being able to see different types of things that are considered anomalies. Splunk and Infosec do its best to give you those insights right out of the box. Things that you can quickly take a look at. Now, if you do have your data in Splunk already, I would definitely log in, check out the Infosec app. If nothing's showing up, let us know. We can see how we can best help you. Network anomaly, same thing. Investigation, high level, where you can search for a user. And searching for a user or searching for a host, you can then drill down to your specifics. I don't know that I actually have a user that, here, we'll use this one right here, A, B, C, D, E. So if you have a user that's having an issue and you want to drill down and just see where they're accessing, where they're doing something, you can just search for that specific user and see what all their data looks like. So easy to drill down by user, by host, compliance dashboard, just high level, reporting of number of accounts, login events, and so on and so forth. So, as you can see, there's a lot of things going on in here, but what's most important is a lot of this comes right out of the box with applications and making sure your data is set up properly. Alerts, incident posture, this app does not have incident management in it, but tries to. You can actually set up your alerts in your environment, trigger it to your alert framework, and you may be able to see things trigger inside of here. Incident posture, same thing, very high level. This uses an external application called Alert Manager. But let's see. Last thing is around health. I mentioned data models being very important. You can definitely come in here, look to see how your data models are set up, make sure everything is working and configured inside of your environment to ensure that everything is visible. Now, the one other thing I did mention I was going to show you is around your alerts. Now, if you set up something inside of Splunk, let's say you want to find things that have been blocked, what you can do is you can do a save as. So let's do a pipe stats count. And, I want to be alarmed if, something is greater than, 1,000. So pipe where counts is greater than 1,000. Great. So I have a record that comes up. I can come in here, I can do a save as and select an alert. I can set my alert, we'll call it new alert that does something cool. We can decide how we're going to save it in the environment, whether we want to share it in the app, how often we want to run it. It could be on a cron schedule or use one of the prefab values. And then down at the bottom is where you can do your trigger actions. You have trigger actions that will send to a number of different places. You can do a trigger alert, which is an alert inside of Splunk. You can log it, you can email it, send it to a webhook, many different options. Whatever works within your organization or your school to receive those, absolutely go with it. But everybody that is in the Splunk environment should have the ability to do that. As far as the demo goes, I think that covers the demo. Let's pop back over here. So, if you don't currently have a setup, or if your school's not set up going to Splunk, send an email to the tech center. You can send it over to Omer with the email that is that's on the slide here. And then, what happens is that starts the intake process, usually a conversation with me where we determine what implementation model is best for you. Whether we're going to do the thicker version with the heavy forwarder or the light version with the that would send the data through Cribble. Let's talk about what use cases. Certainly come prepared. Being prepared is very, very important here. When you show up to that first call, understand if you have hardware availability. It's important. Have your public IP available. All of our stuff it goes through whitelisting. We want to make sure that we have all of the information that we can send over to make the search heads available, make the ports available for you to send your data, and make the process as fast as possible. Knowing your data, come to the meeting with a list of the data that you would want in the environment, and we can certainly give you the right strategy or help you with the right strategy to to get that data through. And then a user list is most important. Once we go through the pipeline, we have your data processing, everything's going through. There's a security review of the new RBAC group that's created for you and your team. That'll be tested on our side. Once we test and make sure that everything is nice and tightened up, we will make your users available to search your data and pretty much start your Splunk journey. With that, that is my last slide. If there are any questions, either drop them in chat. Happy to answer them. If not, have a great day.
Thank you, Brian.